This is called The Psychiatrist, the show where psychiatrists answer your questions. I'm Dr. David Handley.
And I'm Dr. Abby Snavely.
On this episode, one listener feels her therapist cancellation policies aren't fair. Another listener is wondering about his therapist's recommendation to increase the frequency of their visits and start psychoanalysis. And finally, a psychiatrist asks how we navigate the financial impact of more frequent therapy sessions.
Say you like me, you better count the ways. Side to side.
Listening to this podcast does not mean we have a doctor-patient relationship. Our intention is to educate and entertain you. Nothing we say is intended or recommended as a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your own physician or other qualified healthcare professional regarding any medical questions or conditions. This first question comes from Danny.
I've been seeing my therapist twice a week for the past 6 months. I'm a bit perturbed. During this time period, my therapist had canceled on me twice within 24 hours of our session, once only a few hours before my session. I was upset because I really needed my session, but I tried my best to be understanding. I don't want her to transfer me. Last week, however, I had a migraine headache, which I know usually lasts for 2 or 3 days. I chose to cancel my appointment for the next day. I canceled at 4 p.m. on Tuesday, and my appointment was 12 p.m. Wednesday. I got charged the full price for the session. I know this is in their policy. They charge you if you cancel within 24 hours. But am I in the wrong for feeling kind of slighted by this? I guess I want your guys' opinion on if I should complain or not. My question, how is it fair that they cancel on me with no financial responsibility, and when I cancel, I have to pay the fee? My time and needs are valuable as well. This doesn't feel right.
So I guess there's two ways we could approach the question. One is Danny's specific situation, and another might be just in general, like the cancellation policies, how they function, why they're there.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think maybe we should talk about the pros and cons of the policy, or how we feel or approach these kinds of policies. Because I know when we chatted about this briefly ahead of time, we had different opinions on how it should go, but maybe we should flesh that out.
Yeah, well, at least for Danny.
Okay, for Danny.
We had some different ideas. Well, I think about where these things come from, and I always go back. I'm sure almost everybody gets the same little lecture or something in training with somebody who's in frequent therapy, like maybe the same time of the same day, once a week, multiple times a week, that it's akin to paying tuition in a college for a class. And whether you go to class or not, whether the professor cancels class, you've reserved that time. You don't really get refund back. I don't know if that's a great metaphor, but I think that's the metaphor that everybody hears.
Well, I know that Freud conceptualized the idea as leasing his time. And so I think that does also, I don't know, a structure that makes it a little bit different.
Well, speaking of the psychoanalyst, there was this idea that when they took vacation, the patient had to take vacation, or if the patient wanted to take vacation and not pay for it.
Right.
I'm taking August off. You patients should probably also schedule your vacations when I'm gone, because you're going to be paying for all the other sessions anyway.
I think, but to be fair, part of that is paying, but part of that is, the continuity of the care, right? And trying to keep the consistency. I know that it's both, but I guess I don't want to be too cynical about the money part. I think that's a piece of what can sting in this type of policy, but I don't think it's the whole deal. So I don't want to overemphasize it.
But you're not defending the vacation policy, are you?
I'm not defending the vacation policy. I'm just saying, and I definitely don't promote that, but I'm saying I think that some of it is about, some of the justification could be about money for the patient, but I also think for the patient's treatment, the idea is also that we can have more continuity that way, especially. But I also, I guess I would like to advocate for, therapists taking a whole month off every August, but I don't think that happens anymore either.
Yeah, right.
Right. I mean, so I think, yes, a different time, but I don't know if the patient gets a month-long vacation and the therapist gets a month-long vacation and they don't line up, that's a lot of time without your analyst. And we know that can be disruptive. So I don't think it's only greed.
Yeah, part of framing that is really, we're talking about psychoanalysis, though.
We are talking about psychoanalysis, but I'm saying that I think it is also for the patient, right? It is for the, and I guess that's, that's kind of what this question is about, is how do we balance the patient's needs versus the therapist's needs?
Yeah, and the therapist has needs. This is your livelihood, and if somebody cancels on you last minute, then you're not getting income.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's part of it. It is my livelihood. It is the therapist's livelihood. I think that's one of the primary differences. I also think that a patient There are things about accountability and time. There's also, I think, respect for the practice of the therapist, that he or she may be busy and needs to know what they're doing with their time. So yeah, I think it's about mutual respect, but the way that the kind of financial responsibility flows, I think, is different here.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one thing, unlike other subspecialists or specialists or whatever, obviously in this world, we're not double or triple booking. The way a traditional doctor's office works, they're bouncing from room to room because there's actually 3 people that were scheduled for, 10 o'clock and 10:05 or whatever. Almost like an airline, like they super saturate it, and they factor in the idea that there's going to be people that no show or cancel. Whereas this, there's no wiggle room. So if somebody
and additionally, right? I mean, that's maybe why I bring up Freud too. It is leasing our time. All we have is our time. And so if the time is not used, it's just not used, and there's nothing else to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing about the time frame of the policy, whether it's 24 hours or 48 or whatever, is that I think most people, I mean, I know you and I do this, we try to fill it. I mean, if we have enough of a heads up, and so even if it's last minute, we would never charge if we could get somebody to take that spot.
Absolutely. And so that's, my policy builds that in, and that's how I explain it to people. If I have enough time, I can usually find someone to take that time. Even if someone is within the cancellation window, if I have somebody on a waiting list or someone I know that is trying to get in and I can reach out to them and put them in that slot, then absolutely, I don't want to double charge for that time. And that's kind of not what it's about. And I think that's an important thing to underline too, that it's not a punishment to the patient who late cancels.
And I think another origin of the policy too is just because this is what, like when you're in your training, this is what you were subjected to. So
no, I think that's fair, right? I know that, I had canceled, for example, in my treatment for other reasons. Maybe I didn't want to go, or I chose something else. But I also remember being like really sick, so sick I didn't go to work, which almost never happens. And, I canceled my session and got charged for it. And I remember having, kind of this visceral reaction of even just like, no, but this one was real. Like I was so sick, I really couldn't come. Not necessarily how dare you charge me, but there was probably a little indignation before I calmed down. So yeah, it's what we're subjected to. And so maybe there's like a tit for tat quality, but I also think that there's a piece of it that is a boundary in a sense that can be helpful. And then I think it also, it can protect the therapist from resentment. And I guess some of that comes down to the reason, which is what I was alluding to there. And I think this is maybe where you and I differ the most, is in terms of what's a good excuse or not.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously there are things that come up that a person can't be there. And the policy is in place. That doesn't mean it's absolutely rigid. But things like illnesses, I think, are really tough, because I don't want to be in a position of deciding if your excuse is a good enough one or not, right? Number one, I think that is detective work on my part that doesn't necessarily seem fair. And on the other hand, I think that for some people, obviously not everyone, it can be an invitation to lie. Right? Maybe somebody really wants to go skiing, but they think, okay, if I say I'm going skiing, she's going to charge me. But if I say I'm sick, then she won't charge me. And I do not want to set up any sort of scenario where someone is enticed to tell the truth or not tell the truth. I just think that's really damaging to the treatment. But there are other things. This is not, a comprehensive list, but deaths in the family, that obviously is one that counts, especially if someone needs to be somewhere or can't. Snow days, I do not ever question. I'm not going to put somebody in danger because they are, trying to get their money's worth or something like that. But also in that same vein, I think, thank goodness, our profession has loosened up a little in terms of telehealth, Zoom, or phone appointments, to be able to say, okay, well, your child had to stay home sick from school, but, there's an increased likelihood that the person can still make the appointment remotely, whereas those cancellations in the past, I think, were a little trickier.
So your exceptions would be, it sounds like, so deaths or weather.
Deaths, weather, like, putting yourself in danger. And again, there may be other things kind of depending on what's happening, but in general, I want to be able to be fair to both them and me, and they're adults, and if they need to miss, they need to miss. But justifying it to me, I don't know. Again, I think sets up a tricky situation that could either compromise the truth or set up something kind of weird between us. I would rather have a policy and talk about it later if we need to. And some of it depends on what kind of treatment somebody's in, right?
Yeah, for sure. Like, and maybe this goes to the Danny's. She's there twice a week. I feel like they have a pretty well-established relationship.
That they ought to be able to talk about it, right? But whereas if it's, a quote-unquote medication check that happens every few months, I think that's a little different, including, are we going to spend the appointment processing what happened or what went on between us? I think that's a different focus, but it's also like a different use of time.
So I don't know. I think my takeaway from what you just said was you're not as rigid as you were presenting it.
I present myself as like, this is the policy. This is what you should expect. But I'm not a robot. And again, not that I'm trying to avoid the implication of the accusation of greed or something, but it's like, it's not just about that either.
Sure.
And kind of how much is enough, I don't know.
Well, so, I mean, I'm all for the policy too. So I don't mean to suggest otherwise, but I think for me, it's like what you mentioned earlier about the resentment.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's more about making sure I'm not getting taken advantage of. So I'm all for having a discussion with somebody, and I'm also all for trusting people. But it's when I'm taken advantage of that it's like we're going to have to enforce the policy, and I'm going to let you know that.
Do you ever get the messages of, I'd really like to cancel for tomorrow, but if you're going to charge me, I'm going to be there. Let me know what you're going to do. Do you ever get that?
I haven't gotten that one.
No, I mean, and I'm just like, listen, again, that's the one. It's like, it's up to you. Like, I'm not your mom. I'm not your enforcer. You get to decide. I also think it also is a show of, I think, respect for our time, but also the work together. Right. And so, I mean, that is what I say to those. It's like, do what you have to do. Here's my policy. But I guess I also think that's something that's worth paying attention to, the putting the decision making on me.
Why don't we talk about Danny's situation?
Yeah. So the fact that her therapist canceled on her twice changes all of what we just said.
Well, I think so. And I'm not saying that Danny's therapist should feel guilty for canceling. I'm sure she had a very good reason, but I can't help but think how guilty I would feel for last minute cancellations. And,
right.
And so maybe that's my pathology, but that would have factored in when she had to cancel before an illness. I don't think I would have charged her. We've got 6 months of working together. It's twice a week. Danny has demonstrated that she hasn't been cavalier about this. She understands the policy. This hasn't happened before. And because
you're making a lot of assumptions, but yes, assuming that's all correct.
Assuming that's correct. And we know that the therapist canceled last minute on her. I wouldn't have charged her. I would have talked about it, but I wouldn't have charged her.
I hear you. And I think it depends. I agree. I would feel very guilty. I think most therapists take this very seriously, or their own cancellations very seriously. Hopefully the therapist had a good reason. I think it's an entirely other discussion of whether the therapist disclosed the reason or not. Danny says she tried to be understanding and that she was upset with the therapist. I have to wonder if they talked about that before, or if Danny's upset and disappointment is something that she tucked away until she got charged for her late cancellation. And then it could be, so you know what I mean, right? It's about being charged for her migraine related cancellation, but I think it's also about her upset and hurt from the times the therapist had canceled on her.
Mm-hmm. I wondered if she'd gotten an explanation, and I also wondered if that would have helped. Again, not that the therapist should give an explanation. There could be disclosures that are uncomfortable, but I did wonder. I know, again, in my own practice, if it was a very last minute cancellation, I probably would provide some context, like maybe not specifics,
Absolutely.
but because it was almost certainly an emergency, if I was doing it same day, I might let them know.
Right.
And again, I don't know if that would have made Danny feel better or not.
It might have. Yeah. And you're right. I think if it was an emergency, I think that's different. In the rare cases I have had to cancel on people last minute, you're right, probably bend over backwards to extend hours on a different day, get them in right away, kind of figure something out to make it up to them. And so I think some of it matters sort of what happened in between. They've been seeing each other for 6 months. It's not clear how recently the therapist made these cancellations. Hopefully, it's not very often. I think kind of twice in 6 months is a lot, but I don't know. I'm also struck by Danny's, comment that she doesn't want the therapist to transfer her.
I know, right? That she could be fired for speaking up about being disappointed. I didn't want to make too big of a deal out of it. Why there's something there for sure. Yeah, either. I
agree, and that also adds to my suspicion that Danny maybe didn't feel comfortable expressing her upset when the therapist canceled before. There's a fear of expressing that.
Either she doesn't trust her, or there's something about getting help from people and how they have treated her in the past. Yeah, there's something about that. Right. That would be such an extreme action.
I agree. It would shock me.
Yeah, I really needed my appointment. And the response would be, I'm going to fire you because you were mad at me, which I think really speaks to why it's so important that she talk about this. I mean, so it gets back to her question, should she complain or not? Well, first of all, I would say, I don't even think that's the right word. I don't think this is complaining. No. I mean, I think it's valid. You had an emotional response to this. That's valid. And I think, again, this is not to be repetitive, but talking about the relationship is fair game for sure.
No. And they are obviously in a real relationship, right? And if it feels like the rules are unfair, or if it feels like the rules are changing or hypocritical, I think that is really foundational to the relationship, which means it's foundational to the work of this therapy. Like, they have to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, and one thing I would ask Annie is, what happens if you don't bring it up? See, I think she would get more resentful, and then that's going to get in the way. It's going to come out in other ways. And so better to talk about where the resentment's coming from, or maybe there's something even underlying that more broadly. But I think the consequences of not talking about it are far greater than the consequences of actually bringing it up.
Oh yeah, man. Right. Like, I would much rather have anger expressed directly and talked about in a session where there's a chance for it to get worked through. But if it comes out sideways or gets acted out, I think there's a very high likelihood of this kind of anger destroying the treatment, conscious or not. And then I think it's a real missed opportunity and a shame, because it sounds like Danny enjoys working with this woman, and, all in all, it's gone well.
Mm-hmm. And to be clear, I don't think she's going to get her money back. But
no, I don't think that's the point.
Yeah, I don't think that's what she's looking for. But but talking about boundaries, talking about policies that are unfair, yes, that you should do that for sure.
Right, that feel unfair, and to whom. But yes.
Go
ahead. Okay. All right.
Thank
Should
you.
we move on?
Dancing just you and me. Cha-cha-cha.
This question comes from Will. I've been seeing a therapist for about a year now, 2 times a week. We're working through a number of issues from my childhood. My therapist has suggested we increase the intensity of our work and transition from therapy to analysis. He says it's likely to change our relationship. Can you please explain the difference between psychotherapy and analysis? What are the benefits? This is a good question. We haven't made a lot of distinction on this show.
No.
And I think probably because there's more similarities than differences.
Yeah. And I think there's also just not a fixed answer, right? I mean, in terms of what will change, I would say probably the frequency of your meetings, but the rest of it is kind of highly variable depending on both you and your therapist and how you've been working together so far.
Yeah, I thought there might be variation on what Will is asking, which is, what are the circumstances where you might suggest something like this? Like, where would you put a patient in Will's position where you're suggesting an increased frequency, or maybe even a shift in how you're approaching it, like with an analysis?
Yeah, I mean, and there's definitely thousands of papers and pages written about analyzability or selection for analysis. So this is obviously not going to be exhaustive, but I think the headline of it is kind of deepening the treatment or deepening the work. I think if people are not progressing how they want to, I think increased frequency is very helpful. I think that Will's talking about childhood issues. So I would say childhood issues, relationship issues. If someone has chronic and fixed problems, where they're getting tangled up with other people in love or work, I think that is a good time to suggest a more frequent or more psychoanalytically oriented treatment.
Well, maybe if I can interrupt for just a second, maybe speak to why the frequency, if someone is stuck or not progressing, as you said, like why would the
Yeah.
increased frequency help move them along?
There's something that can happen even in once a week therapy or twice a week therapy where folks can be really just kind of catching up on the day-to-day events of their life. I think so more frequency just means that, there's less to catch up on, which means you can talk more about thoughts or dreams or fantasies, more time to, well, I guess this gets into some of the differences too, but more time to deepen the relationship, increase the feelings about the relationship, which can be talked about. I also think it takes pressure off both the patient and the therapist to kind of wrap things up and have a plan. That it's sort of like you can really use the whole time, the 45 or 50 minutes, to say, okay, we're out of time. I'll see you tomorrow. Obviously, if someone's super distressed, we're not going to leave it that way, but we don't have to schedule. We don't have to talk about a plan. We just know what the plan is, and you can keep going. So there's a lot less stopping and starting.
So you can hit the ground running. Like it's kind of like
Absolutely.
with each new session, you're not having to, it's like the entering into a conversation and then ending a conversation. It's almost like
Right.
it just gets interrupted
Right.
day to day. Okay.
Right. So, it's, maybe, kind of stereotypically somebody might have their appointments every day, Monday through Thursday, and then have the weekend off. And, Freud or people talk about like a weekend crust, or a time that, getting started on Monday is then going to be, or after any kind of a break is going to be harder than getting started when you just saw each other the day before.
Mm-hmm.
So both easier starting and easier ending, if that makes sense. Or less emphasis on the starting and ending.
I wonder, I don't know if Will has always been in twice a week. I wonder if he could reflect on times when they were working together less frequently.
Right.
I think of that. I think of scabs, it's like
Mhm.
the wound is open. It's
Right.
really hard to be in session. And the longer that time goes by, the harder it is to reopen it.
Right.
And I wonder if he could even reflect that, maybe even the twice a week, that it felt very different than maybe when he was going once a week or once every couple of weeks or something like that. So you can sort of imagine just how intensified that might feel if he's in there many more times in a week.
Yeah, I agree. And I even think it's different, if those 2 sessions a week or 2 days in a row, or have a break in between. Some of that, it can be a difference as well. So yeah, I think those would be good things for Will to reflect on. And, I'll put my plug in. Hopefully he's talking to his therapist, potential analyst about this anyway. But
But what are some other things that you think he might feel differently?
so, there are analysts of all different stripes, but, in addition to the frequency changing and the relationship deepening, as I talked about, there probably will be more emphasis on transference and countertransference, maybe some work with dreams or fantasies. The therapist may be less active or more silent. And again, I think that kind of depends on how they've been working from the beginning. But yes, definitely in kind of a more classical sense, the analyst is waiting for the patient's thoughts and associations and being a lot less directive. So I also would assume that if he hasn't yet, we'll be introduced to the idea of free association. I guess the other thing that, may surprise people is that often people will lie down on the couch. And so some of the idea behind that is if, the patient is lying down and looking away from the therapist, they're free to have their own thoughts and say what comes to mind, which I would agree with many other people who came before me is the number one rule of psychoanalysis is say what's on your mind. That the patient can be less focused on the therapist, less hyper attuned to their expressions or how they're reacting, more free to project or have the thoughts that they're having. For some people, that's scary and they feel too regressed. You can definitely conduct an analysis sitting up. I know people, that are doing analyses on Zoom or on the phone. It's not a requirement, but the use of the couch can also be an important tool. And so I don't know, maybe that's not exhaustive, but that's what comes to mind for me in terms of things that might sort of slide you along that scale from psychodynamic psychotherapy to psychoanalysis.
Well, I think a confusion that comes up, and I imagine this is really part of what Will's question is what is the difference? And the reason it's hard to say is if you look at the history of psychotherapy, largely, what I imagine is a family tree or an evolutionary tree where there's a common ancestor. Well, the trunk of that tree, the common ancestor is psychoanalysis. And
For
so
everything.
the branches start almost immediately. So Sigmund Freud is the beginning, and his mentor, Joseph Breuer. But the branches start immediately, Adler, Jung, and then each time it branches, those people add to, take away. They get their own followers. Their followers branch away in different directions. But whether we're talking about the neo-Freudians or ego psychology or object relations theory, self-psychology, attachment theory, almost all those people started with analysis, and then it's evolved ever since. Even with Aaron Beck and CBT, when his earlier writings, now he was also borrowing from cognitive psychologists and schema, but when you look at how he developed his theory, he was a psychiatrist who was a psychoanalyst. And so not surprisingly, even though the terminology changes, you can still see the thread. You can see the developmental thread. And so I think my take home point here is that if it's all tied to analysis, then we're, by saying, well, what's the difference? It's like, well, it may just depend on what particular school of thought or particular type of training that your therapist has had, where they emphasize certain things and don't emphasize other things.
No, I think that's really well said. It's a really important point. I mean, I don't know, for example, that anyone is going to really challenge the idea that the past influences the present, though I think that's probably a primary focus of an analysis, right?
And I would say psychodynamic theory. I mean, again, if psychodynamic therapy is a composite of all these different theories or some sort of it's almost like the traits that survive the evolution in my mind. The fundamental DNA is what you're saying. The past influences the present. There can be unconscious conflicts that if explored may make a person feel better. I would say transference is a commonality.
Yes. Well, and the definition of what's going to change is highly dependent on what his therapist or his analyst thinks is going to change, right? I mean, that's part of it. I will put a plug. This may just be my thing. I think they're often in a more intensive therapy. And again, that's why I'm kind of trying to frame this on a continuum. Like, where does it tip over into psychoanalysis? I think, is often up for debate. But I think there should be room for a greater range of feelings. And, when I have talked to my patients about an increased intensity or frequency, a deepening of the treatment, I also try to set the stage that I want to hear about all their thoughts and feelings about me, including negative ones, and that this is going to be a whole real relationship that is going to probably or often include negative thoughts or feelings about me, anger, and that I really want to hear that. Often folks really balk against that. Like, do you want me to get mad at you? Like, what is the purpose of this? I can't imagine getting mad at you or hating you. And I know that other people have written in to ask about that. And it's sort of like, it's not required, but I do think it's a part of all of us. And so I think it also is setting the stage for more unpleasant feelings. And sometimes even analysts have a resistance to going deeper because it's going to get harder and it's going to get rougher. It's more satisfying on the other side. I think it can be, one of the best ways to create really lasting and meaningful change, but it's hard and it's harder work, and both people are going to get more uncomfortable more often.
Yeah, your tolerance for people's anger and acting out, I don't know if that's typical. Is it?
I mean, I don't know. I think it was instrumental, as I've mentioned before, in my treatment, that my therapist could handle that. I don't know if it's typical. I do think I'm better at handling it than a lot of other people, but I also think it's helpful.
Do you think it was a result of your analysis that you're better able, or is that just something without having to get into your developmental history?
No, that's fine. That's a really great question. I think maybe I could take it always, but now I know what to do with it. And I think that my capacity changed in my analysis because I think I have a stronger, deeper conviction that it is helpful and important.
I see. Okay.
Right. So like, it's like, I'm not saying it feels good, but I can ground myself in the idea that this is important and potentially helpful if we can make it through. So I think we've answered Will's questions. I mean, his final question of what are the benefits? It's like, well, what benefits do you want? I don't know, but I do think it's a good way to change relational patterns and hopefully free yourself up to have as many choices in your life as you want, which to me is the goal of any therapy.
Well, if you're wondering how does somebody pay for all this, that will lead us into our next question.
Great.
Cha 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 cha.
And this question comes from a psychiatrist in private practice.
My question is regarding increasing the frequency of therapy. In my practice, I do quite a bit of psychodynamic, psychoanalytic-based therapy, and I have several weekly patients, and I have a couple that I feel would benefit from twice weekly sessions. But I am out of network, so it is expensive, and of course, doing twice weekly therapy would be quite an expense. And I'm wondering how y'all handle that with patients, kind of also with yourselves, and would like to hear more about your thoughts on that and how y'all work with your patients on that. If you keep my identity confidential, that'd be great, but I'd love to hear from y'all, and can't wait till y'all move to weekly programming. Thanks. Bye.
I mean, I think this is a great question, right? All of this stuff around fees and money is really tricky, right? I think money is hard for anybody to talk about. And, we want to treat our patients well while recognizing that finances are real. I mean, I think there's maybe a stereotype or a tendency for some people to kind of act like, oh, it's always resistance or something. But it's like, no, this is like money is a concrete reality.
Yeah, this is a really hard topic. And,
Yeah.
when you go to talk to your supervisor about it,
Mhm.
they're going to want to know what's the origin of your low self-esteem. Like, why don't you value yourself enough? Like, why can't you, why do you have such a hard time, like getting paid for your services?
100%. Right.
So I'm glad she's asking us.
Exactly.
Also, this isn't stuff taught in medical school. I mean, I think, when you think about entering into the profession, you have other goals in mind. And so it's just awkward, I think, all around for many people.
Right.
There are some people that it's not awkward for at all. And those usually are the people that charge 5 times more than I do.
And, that also probably attracts a certain type of patient or client, and good for them.
Well, sometimes I'll acknowledge, okay, maybe they're better than I am, but 5 times better? I don't know.
That'd be tough. That'd be tough. Like 2 or 3, I'd buy it in a heartbeat.
Sure.
But you do bring up, we're laughing, but like you bring up an important point, right? Like we need to charge what we're worth. But again, while balancing the needs of the patients, right? Both treatment-wise and financially. And so I do think that it dovetails nicely. Where do you want to start? How do you talk to people about this?
Well, I think more of like the conversation with myself, right? And
Sure.
And I think that's what she's probably struggling with right now.
Sure.
And there's this company line that if you've done a good job with your patient selection, and what I mean by that is you really think that the increased frequency is going to be helpful.
Yeah.
Then, I mean, it's hard for me to say this without rolling my eyes, but the outcome is priceless. To help someone have a life worth living, right? I mean, like you can rationalize.
It's also ethical. Like, I mean, if you really think that, an increased frequency and analysis, whatever it is the treatment of choice for your patient, then I do think we have an ethical obligation to offer that. That doesn't mean that we have to violate, our obligation to ourselves to pay our bills, which is where it gets tricky. But in terms of the recommendation, I think it's important.
Yeah. And I think you and I think we may have different approaches. There is a classist nature about this, though, that
Sure.
I think is hard to swallow sometimes when you get into this level of intensive therapy. It's that notion that the rich get richer. You have to have a certain amount of privilege to even start this kind of therapy, to benefit from the kind of therapy, and then to have the luxury to start seeing somebody 2, 3, 4 times a week, because you're aiming for self-actualization, like that can feel indulgent. And when you're trying to treat a larger number of people, because of course all those slots limits your availability to treat other folks with other conditions and other financial resources. So I don't know. I think it's a tough dilemma.
I think it is, but I guess I also want to say that I think maybe there are some people, but I have not met anyone who embarks on a really intensive psychotherapy, both time and money and effort wise, just for fun or just for self-indulgence. Like maybe, I'm not going to totally rule that out, but at the same time, I think it is hard work. I think people are suffering. I think it's important. I'm not saying I don't agree with your other arguments about kind of access. And I've had very spirited debates with friends kind of in community health psychiatry about is it better to give the best treatment to fewer people or give, I would say, maybe mediocre or less ideal treatment to more people. But I do think it's a legitimate criticism, including the class part of it. At the same time, I don't think that we have to say that just that all the rich people are just sort of luxuriating in their money and their access to their doctor.
I don't think the motivation is indulgent, but I think the feeling
it's super hard.
But I think it can feel indulgent.
Sure.
Also, I'm not sure that it's the best treatment. I mean, again, it has to do with selection.
Well, for some people, I think it is, though. So I guess you're saying with yourself, you're deciding, what does this person need? What do I need? I guess financially, am I in a position to lower my fee if they need to have a lower fee to achieve that frequency? Is that right?
That's what I do. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I slide my fee, and even if that means, and I would say this to Dr. S, that I think it's so rewarding if you've got the right patient selection, that it ultimately is worth it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. I think, you don't want to slide so far. And this is part of why the personal work for the therapist is important, but you don't want to slide your fee so much that you feel resentful. You don't want to put yourself in financial trouble to be able to offer this. But yeah, I think most people who are regularly offering, multiple time a week therapy recognize and accept and maybe even embrace the idea that they're not making the maximum amount of money possible, obviously. I mean, right, like there's ways to do that. I think part of how this gets tricky too, though, is sort of determining or helping your patients determine what they can afford. Because sometimes, like we say, like money is a material reality and, really they don't have the money in their budget. But sometimes, especially and this is, recognizing the class implications, but sometimes people are just saying, I don't want to prioritize my money in this way, right? Like when they say they can't afford it, it's not that they don't have it. They just would rather spend it on something else, which is like totally legitimate. But I think that's where it gets like a little bit trickier.
Often, I think when you look at what a person may have paid prior to coming to you,
right,
in trying to understand themselves or feel better, whether it was classes or seminars or self-help books or any number of alternative treatments, sometimes it's far exceeds like what they might be paying you for therapy. So I think that's important, to maybe put that in context.
I mean, I think it is, or, there was some kind of sadomasochism probably or other issues, but, I remember having a patient for whom I slid my fee because she said she couldn't afford it. I believed her immediately. And then, she would come in and at least once a month, say, do you like my new purse? It only costs $6,000, and like show it off. So, I mean, this is kind of like an overt example of it, but it's sort of like, okay, and I'm not saying I want my patients to suffer or make it hurt, but sometimes, again, that's also very arguably a luxury good. And then I did start to get resentful, which again was, I think, part of the dynamic that we had to look at. But it's like, well, I understand that you want to pay for your purse more than you want to pay for me, but what's that about? So sometimes it is a therapeutic issue, but I don't think it's always a therapeutic issue. And this is where it gets tricky.
And the purse probably made her feel pretty good for a second.
Right. No, I know. And I wanted her to look inside and do some hard work. So I get that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we're talking about fees more in general. And then we're trying to talk about specifically for these patients that are coming multiple times a week. Because in the general sense, I have seen people for free and still see people for free. But see, I don't know that I could offer that 3 or 4 times a week. Right. So it's like that balance of, well,
and then there's a part of then that person is actually just taking up all of your low fee slots.
Right. That gets back into how you're rationing care at that point.
Right. To your point, there are interesting arguments or ideas about how to do that. I have told people, when I believe it's true, I would rather see you twice a week for 10 weeks than once a week for 20 weeks, right? This is obviously for people who are not living paycheck to paycheck or something like that, but to be able to say, can we do this for a shorter period of time with more intensity and then kind of reevaluate where we're at? This is not a way to trick somebody, but it may be a way to show the utility of that. And sometimes I think you can get more done in that way. I've asked people to come up with a monthly budget of what they think they can afford. And then that's just what they pay every month. And if they're on vacation, they still pay that. If I'm on vacation, they still pay that. If there's a federal holiday or something. And again, like not trying to abuse that, but it's like, okay, if this is your budget, I want to see you as often as possible. And some months, that's going to be 8 or 10 times. And some months it may only be 4 or 5 because it's the winter holidays.
I was thinking, as you even set that up, the twice a week for 10 weeks, I wonder, having a termination date also speeds everything up, makes everything.
It absolutely
rich.
does.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. There's another factor there that's probably less about frequency and more about the time limited nature of it.
Right. Yeah, that I also think is helpful. And I think it's important to have times where you reevaluate where you're at. So I think, often for therapists, because in theory, we're kind-hearted folks who want to help, and people tend to be, I think there's usually a tendency to lower our fees too fast. But I think it's just like important to have a process around it. And I think I've said that before, there's different ways to frame it. And I think these are real where, yeah, I might actually, I don't buy $6,000 purses, but I might want some sort of expensive outfit rather than seeing my therapist for one session. But overall, like you said, in the priceless sense, but then, a couple $100s is harder to swallow than tens of thousands of dollars for the overall change that was able to be achieved.
Yeah, I think we talked about this before, that the value in one session is harder to justify than the value after a prolonged period of time of doing the work.
That's right. And, we do all put different meanings, right? Like I might bulk and say, I'm definitely not spending $5 on a cup of coffee. It's ridiculous. That's way too much money. But then to go spend whatever, $5 for something else might be a great deal. A glass of wine would be a great deal, right? They're both just drinks. What? No, I'm serious, right? And so I think that maybe actually is a good comparison because some of it's about the value you put on it. And it's also a hard proposition when you are offering something new to a patient and the value is yet to be proven, right?
Mm-hmm.
To be able to say that. I also think for Dr. S, when you're setting up these conversations, it is much easier to lower your fee than to raise it, for sure. But making that part of the discussion of saying, we'll reevaluate, but as your income increases, we'll renegotiate the fee. Or I've had people where, okay, if you're coming 3 days a week, I will lower your fee. And then later they go back to once a week and they still want the 3 times a week fee. And it's like, and that's hard. I remember my analyst, I was a resident, saying I really look forward to the day when you can pay my full fee, which I thought was obnoxious, but it was kind of funny.
Yeah. It has to be delivered well.
Yeah, I know, right? But it's I look forward to that day for both of us, where it's actually more money, but as a chunk of my income, it's actually less significant.
Mm-hmm. Right. One other thing that I do, and I realize I'm going to be opening myself up to criticism because it goes against our earlier question with Will and what's the benefit of the frequency. Mm-hmm. I do think that sometimes you can get not the same, but you can deepen treatment with a longer session. And so sometimes I think by almost splitting the difference a bit, so it's not going to cost as much as if you came twice, but we may, just by having a little bit more time, it might actually keep that area open longer enough to get a little bit deeper. I don't know how you think about that, but
I've never thought about that before, but that's interesting. I know that, well, I guess, and I will get the details of this wrong. So again, this is the part if people are still with us, they can criticize us all they want. I think there was an analytic institute somewhere in Europe that was offering, and this was fairly recently, offering training to Russian students. But it's the Russians would come in to whatever European city and stay for weeks, 6 or 8 weeks, and get analyzed all day, every day.
Oh.
And then go back home, for the other 10 months of the year. And that was like, that's what counted as their analysis. Like they just went in super deep for that period of time because, whatever area they were in didn't have analysts.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I think you got to come up to breathe though. Like,
I don't know. I did. You're right. I did a couples intensive therapy for a weekend once, and I thought I was going to die. You're absolutely correct. And that was 2 days.
it is. I do think it's harder on the patient for sure. I mean, I've seen.
I can't imagine the regression. People had to be so unwound.
Even what I'm proposing, even what I do, I know that it's harder on them.
Right.
But I also, again, there's so many factors. Like where I live, it's actually, even if there were no barriers to coming every day,
Right.
there are barriers like the weather and the mountains and
Correct.
the drive alone. And so sometimes you just have to be more creative. And I think that's been one way I've tried to look at that to see if that could be helpful, both financially and because of all these other reasons.
Well, and I think that's the issue with like any of these answers, right? That it always depends. It always depends on the person. It always depends on the context. And by the person, I was meaning the patient, but I also mean the therapist. And, I think it's fine if some of what we say seems contradictory because as you're pointing out, like these aren't hard and fast rules. Like ideally it should just be a way to think through it and recognizing and respecting both yourself and your patient, I think is the balance we're always trying to achieve. And maybe when it comes to frequency and money, it's even more tricky.
Yeah. And maybe finally her last comment when she's looking forward to us turning these out weekly.
Yeah, just wait. If you have to balance your patient's needs, your needs, and your podcast needs, then like that's next level.
I would definitely need some help.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I need a different life. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. S. Thank you, Danny and Will, all of you for your questions. And thank you for listening. If you have questions, send an email or leave an audio message at our website, callthepsychiatrist.com. You can also send us a message on Instagram or Facebook at Call the Psychiatrist. And please tell somebody about the show so that we can keep growing.
Do it.
Take care.
Bye.